Hello and welcome to the back office show. I just had my breakfast and I'm just doing a little bit of streaming. I thought I'd do a little bit of streaming before I start my day in a few minutes. And I came across this link in Twitter and it was crazy interesting. And it's about all of the old graphical user... Oh, my phone's beeping. Let me turn that off. All the different graphical user interfaces through the ages, because everybody knows about... Steve Jobs, and how Steve Jobs went to Xerox PARC and then stole their interface, and that's the legend of Apple. But really, if you look here, there's quite a long lineage of what happened in these interfaces. It definitely wasn't stolen necessarily by Steve Jobs, although probably inspired. And definitely Microsoft didn't steal Windows 3.1 from Apple either. So let's have a look through this little list here. And I can see several people joining already. Good morning. Good morning, one and all. Thank you for joining me. Let's see. So here, 1973, first operational Alto computer in Xerox PARC. So this is the one that's always referenced. You can see it's a CRT on its side. But look, 3-button mouse, bitmap display. I mean, these were the first two things that really changed everything. If you remember, like IBM and ICL PCs up to that point didn't have bitmap displays. But look, this picture's not clickable, so we'll just keep moving on. Three Rivers Corporation. Now, I've heard of the PERC. We've heard of PERC, but Three Rivers, who knows where they went? They must have just sort of disappeared into nowhere. But let's just see what more info. Oh, it's just a bit of a glib description of that company. So let's see. That's 1973, but look, nothing actually really happened for ages till sort of 1981 when Xerox sort of released their second one, the Star. And I'm not really sure, like, if you think of Xerox, where they sort of went to photocopiers. They've sort of gone nowhere with their computing technology. So I'm guessing at this point, this was just their sort of experimental stuff that they weren't really serious about it. But you can see here, it looks very much like a normal graphical interface with the double-clicking icons, dialog boxes. Look at that, a 1024 by 768 display in 1981. That would have been like mega amazing. And then interestingly here, if you think of Steve Jobs' project after the Apple II, that was his Lisa, his sort of pet project, 1983. So it's only a couple of years later that there's actually computing GUI type things starting to happen in sort of the general market here. And it looks very much, I'm looking at this picture and I'm thinking, is that really the Lisa? Because it looks very much like if you had an SE30 Mac Classic, any of those, identical really. It's like they never really changed anything. They never really changed anything up to sort of OS 8 or whatever they called it. Before OS 10, obviously, then completely changed everything. But you see this VSI Corp, then next one on, and that's really interesting because if you look at the picture below, that's the first Microsoft Windows. Because remember, like Windows had Windows, I don't know, 186, 286. There's sort of several versions before you had the memory management in the 386. But you can see that the graphics displays aren't, I don't think they're technically bitmap displays. They're more like graphical ASCII windowing. And if you used earlier versions of Microsoft Basic, Visual Basic, you'll recall it actually was ASCII. I can't remember what version that would have been, version 1 or 2 or something. I think up to version 5 was definitely graphical, but before then it was using ASCII characters to do all the windowing and sort of overlapping. But you know, it's going really quick at this point because you've got 81, 83, and then boom, 84. That's the proper full-on Mac. So this is the thing after the Lisa, the bit that really now sort of the first sort of area really when Apple sort of started to become popular with the desktop and newspapery type things, the creative stuff. And it looks again pretty much there. I can see Atari Staffroom's on there. You definitely was going to be shouting about Gem, because if you had an Atari ST, of course, they all started to look quite similar, especially if you use an Atari ST on the high-res monitor, because it was a sort of similar resolution. And then you can see immediately underneath that you had Gem, and Gem was ported to loads of stuff. Like it says here, later ported to Atari ST. I think there was a story about that, and Atari Staffroom can correct me on this, that there was the option that Atari was going to use either Gem or use something like Unix, and they went with Gem. That decision probably helped them get to market and got them the success they could in the market, but really Can you imagine Atari ST using Unix back in the day? I mean, that's pretty much OS 10 like Mac did, Apple did later on. It would have been a whole different ball game in terms of the type of computer it would have been. And then, yeah, Windows System X, again, 1984. I find it hard to believe that this sort of X Windows system was that old, really. And then that sort of found its way into Linuxes and various things after that. But there's some really, really unusual ones I've noticed here. So this GUIS for Commodore 64, I mean, wow. The only sort of early 8-bit type graphical interfaces I recall was the AMX mouse on the BBC. So this thing looks amazing. I'd like to get an emulator running a Commodore 64 and just trying that, because look at the detail of there. You've got everything that you'd need: the waste paper bin, a disc, but yeah, all floppy based, bonkers. And one of the more, I think, uglier ones at the moment is this sort of Amiga workbench. And again, this is version 1, and I had various Amiga setups, and I certainly remember much later versions of the Amiga where it looked a lot better than this. So I can't tell you what versions it was of the OS of the desktop, but I'm thinking version 3. We had a little red ball thing. That's when that became popular. And Microsoft finally releases the first version of Windows. So this is the sort of predecessor to Windows 286 and stuff like that. Again, it's got that very much ASCII minimalist bitmap, but it doesn't. You can see, even if you look at it, you can see the characters on the screen are almost made up of a fixed size ASCII-ish type block. They definitely don't look like a bitmap display that you'd have got. You notice some machines, if you ever used a Sun workstation, and when you used to boot up in those ones, instead of getting that sort of ASCII type BIOS, you get a really nice smooth graphical thing. And Apple's do the same. That just shows the underlying technology. When you're using the DOS stuff or the early Windows stuff, it's still using probably those DOS calls for generating things. I can't remember. Is it interrupt? I remember, which register was it for DOS? It was register 20 or something. You could just create half the function calls for DOS to do anything with it. I'm showing my age now, where I've forgotten my assembler for DOS. But here, 1986, Apple threatens to sue DR Research. So this is like, even back in the day, they were trying to sue each other for stuff that they'd stolen or ideas they'd taken from other people. Absolutely bonkers. So that looks like a picture of Gem there, but now has just 2 unmovable, non-resizable windows for file browsing. So that's it. Apple screwed Gem, and they've got this just shitty 2 windows that don't do anything. Lame. I want to see a picture of this though. Look, I can't get a big one, but Tandy. Tandy releases personal Decimate for their Tandy 1000EX. I don't even know what a Tandy 1000EX is. I'm guessing it could be some sort of CPM type thing. It's certainly... I don't think it was a sort of Windowsy DOS type machine. 1987, the Apple Macintosh 2, the first colour Mac. That almost looks like, ooh, look at that. So I kind of looking at this, you almost get confused thinking it was like Microsoft Paint. So I'm guessing Paint came after this. So Steve Jobs would have gone mental. Or is this Photoshop? It can't be Photoshop. Look at the features. Maybe it was. But look, back in the day, if that was Photoshop, it was no better than Paint. Bonkers. And then look at Microsoft stuff. It looks really crap. Apparently there was a big falling out between the two over this. Steve Jobs was like, Bill Gates, you mother effer, you stole my thing. But, was he really that worried? Look at it. It's just bullshit. But I definitely remember it. And I remember really... oh, it is a PC, the EX1000. Thank you. 1000EX. It's just an AT. But look at this bonkers thing. It's just, yeah. I guess they were worried that they thought, so they were more concerned about other people using the whole windowing interface, not about the graphical look and feel. But I guess IP is IP, and I do remember this. If you remember the Acorn Archimedes, you had this Arthur desktop, and again, they all had their own features. And it just reminded me. I just remind myself of one of the features of the Amiga one, which I don't know if it's going to come down later in this list, but I remember one of the later Amiga desktops, you could do really crazy things. Like when you opened a floppy, you'd get this really big display where you'd have sort of graphics there that are made up of the icons. So they could do different things. It was almost like early HTML, I think. So they could be metadata stored within the root file folder, so that could display where the icons are and how they look and how they're positioned, so that you'd see like this big picture. And I think later Mac started to do that, where you'd have this sort of big icon still displayed in the normal file window. But yeah, I'm sure someone will comment on that. But I'm pretty sure I'm not just incorrectly remembering that. You definitely did have those big icons. Finder 1 for Apple II. So Apple II is still hanging around in 1987. Can you believe it? That is the product. If you think about it, though, the Apple II is really what kept Apple going all that time, through all the Lisas and early Macs and all the screw-ups and all that crap. We've built Steve Jobs leaving and that, the old Apple II, and that must be running for like a long time, right? But at that point, like a decade of Apple II. Still going, and it looks very much Mac at that point. So a lot of people are probably thinking, why am I going to buy a Mac? I might as well just keep on the old Apple II. And then here you go, OS 2. Do you remember that? OS 2. I mean, I think later there's going to be another update in this list, because they did another OS 2 thing later on, which is OS 2 what? But think about IBM sort of operating system, desktop type stuff. People forget they had a lot of business software, but they integrated a lot to their mainframes, and that was one of their key selling features. So you're saying, why would anybody use any of the IBM stuff when you had a lot of Microsoft going on? In fact, it says here, look, written by Microsoft, but they needed it. They needed to sort of bring up to date their interfaces for talking to all of their mainframes and other networking type devices. And that's why, that's why it sort of exists. And here you go, look, next. So here, this would have been after Steve Jobs was already booted out of Microsoft, Apple, and he decided, I'm going to do it again. I'm so great. It's my idea, man. So I'm going to create another Lisa and do it right. And he was a bit childish at that point, if you recall. He did a lot of screw ups, a lot of soul searching. But yeah, he created the Next, and history's shown that Next didn't really pan out, but it got him back into Apple, and then he used a lot of the ideas from the desktop and the OS and basically rebooted the Apple OS as a Unix one and got rid of all that legacy crap. Imagine that, being able to take all your legacy. If you could do that with Microsoft right now, in that you just say, okay, whatever Windows 10, 8, all of that, fine. We're just going to do something new with all the latest and greatest technology and start fresh. That's kind of what he did, and the rest is history. Here we go, Amiga Workbench 2. So yeah, see, I'm pretty sure this is when the big icon-y stuff started to happen here. You definitely have more interesting type icons, and that mouse cursor, you see that there? That is quite when I see that, it's quite emotive of a memory, seeing that big old orange cursor, all pixely like that. And I think it was pixely even if you had booster cards to increase your graphics resolution and that sort of thing. The mouse cursor always looked the same. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm pretty sure I remember that. Windows 3. Well, we all know Windows 3. That was pretty much quite popular. Probably when I was at university, you had NT version, I don't know, 4 or something, which just looked like Windows 3 still. And I think you just had already, Windows 95 on the sort of home computers. But stuff at uni, I think, was still looking a lot like that. That was a pretty common desktop back in the day. PC GEOS, I guess they're still trying to get on with it, aren't they? They're like, we're still competing. Imagine you thinking now, though, you could try to compete with Microsoft by bringing out your own sort of desktop OS manager type software. GeoWorks are still doing that. Look, in 1990, they obviously felt they still had a chance. We still got a chance, boys. Competing with IBM as well. OS X2 version 2, a true 32-bit OS. So wow, they've sort of blinged it up there. Again, don't really. Whenever I've seen these being used, it was all sort of still to interface their legacy sort of DOS type systems. So again, Windows managers, they're kind of useful and they're kind of not. And then we're going to cover just in a moment one that is I remember my dad using. I'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, Windows 3.1, exactly the same as Windows 3. I don't think you'd even be able to notice the difference. Let's say multimedia enhancements. It may have come with a media player. I don't know. I think Windows 95 had the secret Weezer video, so I don't know what Windows 3.1. I think it had Canyon Canyon.mid. Canyon.mid, right? Do you remember that? Do 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 do. Yeah, that's the one. Now it's in your head. Have a look it up. It's going to like lock into your brain if you listen to that MIDI file again. Right, quarter desk. I remember my dad talking about this. He had sort of DOS versions of this, backup desk view, and they obviously made a more graphical version, which is this one now, which is a later version. And yeah, this was sort of crazy in that it was a kind of terminate stay resident type program. So you could run like Lotus 123 and WordStar and whatever else in the background and flip between them. And clearly they just sort of moved that onto something in a more graphical form. But the reason these products existed is that you could write macros to do things, so that you could actually interface between your, you know, copy some data out of Lotus 123 and then paste it in a WordStar mail merge, for example. It's because the applications at the time didn't have these sort of universal APIs to talk to each other, and that's how companies like this managed to exist, because this is just the very first early days of automation. And yeah, Quarterdeck were in there, I remember that, but I think again history has shown that they didn't really get very far with it, because of course all of the Microsoft and IBM with their OS2, to be fair, were obviously moving towards that idea of joined up sort of design in software. Amiga Workbench, look at this. This is looking a bit pimp though, but yeah, it's almost like, look at the colours and the fonts and everything. It's like, you know, when you had somebody doing a bit of video editing for the first time and they see their effects palette and it's like, we must get in as many effects and all of the effects to make this amazing. This is what this picture looks like. It's like almost trying to demonstrate everything you can do, but I think we all went for a more less is more approach eventually, but it's very colourful, and colour was something you didn't see much of back in the day, really. That's why really Atari STs and Amigas, they always, when you see how they were being sold, it was always being sold on their like, wow, you know, look how colourful and bright we are and creative. Now this is looking, there we go. So this is the Microsoft NT, and remember this sort of stuff started to come out, you see it's 1993, but it persisted for ages. So even though you were using Windows 95 at home with the start bar and all of those things, the NT and more businessy type ones still use the old Windows 3.1, but I guess if it works, well, there's nothing to fix there. You just need something that you can turn on, work, you know, do your networking, and again, early days of kind of more lightweight networking, so it all worked. Do you remember the old BNC connectors on the network cables? Because the cables were all coax, none of this RJ45 stuff. QNX microkernel stuff. I can't believe it's that early, to be honest, 1994. There are a lot of devices using a QNX kind of real-time operating system. I think the 3Com Audrey was using it. There's lots of gadgets, and it does kind of exist. I think it might have turned into something that Palm may have acquired, or Nokia, or, you know, it's one of those things that's evolved into something, evolved into something, evolved into something. It doesn't exist, I don't think, anymore in its kind of any kind of original form, but it's sort of, its DNA resides in sort of some old maybe feature phones or something we don't use anymore. And then look, the legendary Windows 95, and I think almost the rest was history, really. So many things from Windows 95 have persisted now. If you think of Windows 3.1, you had the Windows and maximize, minimize, OK, cancel. That's pretty much it, and maybe a toolbar file manager. And now you've got sort of Windows 95, and I think that was the best one. A lot of us grew up with Windows 95, and it's pretty damn good OS. It doesn't work great on tablets and things like that, and that's what sort of Windows 10 has tried to bridge the gap, but even that doesn't work really. It's not a good paradigm. But yeah, we sort of had Windows 95 and Windows 95 variants, be it 98, Millennium and all that, for a long, long time. And we were very annoyed when they changed it. And BIOS. I remember being really excited about using BIOS. I just want to see the date again. 95, I can't believe it's that old. By the time I got hold of it, it was a few years later, but it was glorious. It was a really nice sort of Unix type operating system, very much like your OS 10. It did pretty much everything, and by the time I got hold of it, it was either free or open source, or the company had already gone bankrupt, so it was really annoying. But it just goes to show that no matter how much you now how much you kind of invest in it, how great the idea is, it just might not take off. And this is one of those ones which is really annoying that it didn't take off. I would like to see this resurface again. You know, I think it's still contemporary enough that it will work with a lot of modern paradigms, and it would be quite cool if there's sort of a version for Raspberry Pi or something like that, because you'll find that some of these OSs, if you use something like Linux now, Linux used to be it run on any old kind of crappy hardware. That's what was brilliant. You know, you could just run it. But now Linux is such a beast. You need such reasonably high specs if you want a decent version of any of the desktop versions, that maybe something like B could have its place back in the world. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. But yeah, if you haven't tried it, download a copy. You can probably run it in a VM because it just runs on normal PC hardware, although there might be a PowerPC version as well. Just have a little play and just see what that was like. Sort of back in from 95. Crikey, that was probably about 5 years later before I even tried it. Because of course, before I forget, you see here the B box. They actually were trying to make a whole computer, like, you know, imagine like Sun. So here you can see custom multi-processor system. They were actually trying to make their own workstation with this. So when I was using it, it was obviously that had failed, and they just tried to sell the OS so that anybody could use the OS and buy that. New Deal releases New Deal Office, formerly PC GUIS. So they're not dead yet. They're still like banging on here, but look how this is really Windows 95-y. And the weird thing is, this is clearly running on PC. This is a PC hardware thing. So look, even the hot tip, I'm kind of almost confused now, because you kind of think, is it actually running Windows stuff? Can it run Windows stuff? It's really weird. Is it just a DOS graphical manager? I don't even know why this exists. I think it's sort of maybe a good one to sort of have a look at through some emulators. And this was a really big deal. This was OS 2 Warp, and they made IBM tried to make a big launch of this in the same way that Microsoft would have. So this was all like bells and whistles. OS2 Warp, bang, bang, bang. You need Warp, and it runs not just DOS stuff, but it also ran Windows stuff. That was kind of one of their little tricks, that you could run Windows 95 software, to be honest, in it, and everything will work. You've got all these desktops that we're quite used to now. If you run Linuxy things, have the multiple desktops, and there's a lot of a big thing about that. But again, it just disappeared into nobody knows about it anymore, really. Nobody talks about it. You might have to use it if you need to do a bit of PL1 or Rex programming on some ancient IBM mainframe in a factory or something. They probably still have some old crusty versions of Warp running, but IBM just aren't in that game anymore. I don't really know. I think IBM are in a bad place, and we're seeing probably poof, they'll disappear into obsolescence like so many things. And this is Windows NT when they finally got their stuff together. And you see here, same user interface as Windows 95, but it says here only a year later. But then I guess it would have been many years before we'd have seen this in industry, for example, because it might be 5 years before the IT spend would have gone on that and everybody would have migrated. So it's like Windows 95. When did you see actually Windows 95 and have it installed on the computer? I bet you it wasn't in 95. It would have been in 6 or 96, 97 at the earliest. I don't ever remember any time I hear Microsoft release a product, there was always used to always be a big lag before you'd see it anywhere. So OS 8, not OS X8, that doesn't make sense. This is when this was quite a big deal at the time, and I remember this is when they had this sort of new generation of PowerPC type Macs, and they're running this sort of standardized new operating system and GUI, and I thought it sucked, to be honest with you. Those Macs of that time, and they were kind of shit. Not beat about the bush, they were a bit shitty, but they started to get good in the end, because that's when Steve Jobs eventually got back to Apple and just kicked out all the crap hardware. Oh yeah, I had an Apple Newton and iMac and eMac and all of those. The weird thing is, some of those generations, I remember the iMac actually was running OS 8 and then upgraded that to OS 10, and it just about did it. It was a Mac, one of those big blue ones with the DV, the digital video editing one. So that was pretty good. And then by the time we had like an eMac, that was fully OS 10, so it got its crap together. So the first thing Jobs was to sort of get rid of all of the old crap hardware, start bringing in good hardware, and then ported obviously elements of Next or Next over, and that became OS 10. And then again, rest is history. We're still using that stuff now. That's 1997. So crikey, many years later. That was good. It's good when people get their crap together, because they've set up a good framework that's just going to take that company or product forward for years. Windows 98, great, just an update to Windows 95 really. I don't think it really did anything apart from add some bullshit desktop ActiveX desktop crap, which we all turned off anyway. KDE, KDE and GNOME, they're probably like the most popular type Linuxy desktops. But Linux is a weird one because it has this sort of X Windows manager, and then you have different Windows decoration managers, things like that. It doesn't see, it's always an evolution rather than a revolution when you use them. So whether you're using KDE or GNOME, it's meh to most people at home, or Unity if you're using Ubuntu. But whatever, it's good. It's good that they were trying. A lot of resources were being spent in this sort of competing camps between one or the other. Windows, what's this? 98 Lite, an installer that removes installation. Okay, I think this is all part of when Microsoft was before or during the time they were getting sued for just being a bastard now, because when you used to install Windows 98, it would put Internet Explorer and AOL and all this other junk on your machine and bloaty stuff, and they were saying it wasn't fair because other people don't get a look in, and Bill Gates got a slap on the wrist for that. And I do believe they're working, they just had that. Germany, I think, has just successfully either sued or done something to Microsoft, like a restraining order to say stop pushing updates and crap onto our people's computers without their knowledge or without the choice of saying no. Stop it! And they have to, but just probably for Germany, not the rest of us, so we're still screwed until somebody fights our cause. Here's GNOME. So you had your KDE earlier, now you've got your GNOME, and I probably like GNOME a bit better. I think it's a bit slicker, but there's not much in there. OS 10 server. There you go. What's this one? Is that an OS X server? A Unix spec? I don't know whether the server's throwing me as if it's almost like to say that it's a server edition, but it's not. So that's their sort of next derived software, which we all know and love now today. RISC OS. Now, this is the these RISC PCs. I believe these are sort of a derivative of your Archimedes, and I think, is it A3000, I want to say? I can't remember. I did have some of those Archimedes that did look like Atari STs and Amigas. And RISC-OS, they did try to make desktop PCs of some description. I remember some sort, I want to say, yellow-coloured PC, and that would have been the OS for them. And yeah, it kind of all died on its arse at that point, unfortunately. We don't hear much about them, but I think maybe it might run on Amiga hardware now. There's all these weird sort of ports now and reboot hardwares, FPGA things that are trying to do stuff, but I'm not sure there's that much interest in them anymore. Aqua's when stuff really changed. So if you see here, new look for upcoming macOS 10 client. So client is, that thing probably was a server edition, as in running on some sort of server hardware, because this is though what we're really familiar with when you think of our OS 10, which is that bar on the bottom, and it had that really cool zooming magnification effect when you sort of hover your mouse over it, and people just fall in love with that and say that must be great. Although if you use OS 10 at the time, it feels really clunky compared to maybe even Windows 95, because there's a lot of clicks, but then it's easier to find your way around if you want to sort of look at your preferences. So I don't know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Windows 2000. Now this is where stuff got real, I thought, for Microsoft. Windows 2000 is really when everything gelled, as far as I'm concerned. The OS became a proper OS, and that's where you had the Windows 95 code base that was kind of the old Windows 3. A lot of legacy DOS bullshit was thrown out of the window, and you had a new kernel based on NT that had proper driver structure, proper everything was good in it. It was just a really solid OS. So as soon as PC started to get Windows 2000, the experience just went up. It was a really nice, rock solid experience. And to be fair to Microsoft, a lot of the underlying experience of Microsoft products is still based on that. We can argue about Metro and what they've done to the glitter on the top, but underneath, Windows doesn't really crash as much as it used to be fair. It's pretty bloody reliable. And XP really is the same thing. It again, you can see if that 2000 was NT5, XP is just NT5.1, so that you're just all full on NT. It's a bit weird, by the way, because the next one, 2003 server, was just really like a throwback, looked like Windows 95 and just sort of really basic. But then it only has to be basic because it's just an admin interface to Microsoft SQL Server and domain domain servers, or whatever they used to be called, ActiveX directory and all of that stuff. Now, React OS, this is an interesting one because this is, I believe, an open source project to recreate Windows 95, and I remember being very interested in this and following this for a while, and yeah, I just sort of petered out really. I don't really know why I was interested in it at the time, and I think that's the problem we get with some of these projects, because you go, that's really cool, I can get a Windows you know, clone for free, and like here it can use the device drivers and run some of the software, but you're kind of like, well, meh, why? Windows is pretty much free with a new computer, and you know, even if you buy a copy, it's not that much, and hooky copies were just everywhere at the time. I don't think Microsoft really tried to enforce, you know, seriously stop people pirating it, because it's just still more people using Windows, right? And all their companies they work for end up using Windows because all of their workforce use Windows at home. So I'm not sure they were that bothered at the time about that. Windows Vista. So Vista is almost worth just skipping over. It was just some bullshit glitter on a pretty, made it more buggy if anything. I thought it was a pretty unreliable OS. It just had all this. See, but I mean, they never really do anything interesting. They just add some shit on the top, which is an application that any third party could have done, and just call it a new OS. It's just weird, isn't it? You get away with a lot when you're doing OS development. I think they don't really have to do much between versions on that one. Windows 7, yeah, I think there was something good about 7. 7 was a bit more real. I think they changed stuff that made 7 a bit bonkers, but when you got used to 7, it was good. It was good. And Windows 8 was, I think, Windows 8 sort of crapped all over that, whatever the good steps they did in 7. And 7 lasted for ages. 7 was all right. That was a good OS. Yeah, Ubuntu, Unity, again, weird when it came out, but pretty rock solid. I quite like you can just throw in a Ubuntu disk, install Unity, and just get on with it. But they're actually dropping their Unity interface now, and I don't know what they're going back to. Probably GNOME, and yeah, GNOME 3. Maybe GNOME 3, but I think they're using one of the later versions. I'm not sure where we are with GNOME, but GNOME is just, again, rock solid. It's fine, mate. GNOME 2, if it's like a fork, does it really count as a different OS? You see, we're getting a bit more fewer and far between now. These are just really evolutions on each product now. Again, Microsoft just building their Metro thing that absolutely everybody hated. It was just totally shit, and I think that's when Ballmer got fired, because he did no, not just Ballmer, actually. Ballmer left, and I can't remember the name of the guy who was doing the graphic GUI stuff, but the arrogance of Microsoft, and now they got their comeuppance, didn't they? Because, you know, they've been trying to force this down people's faces, trying to be cool and hip. They're trying to be an Apple, and it just goes south. You know, you can't just try to come up with all these random ways of doing stuff, just forcing it on people, and it just really backfired big time. And you can see here Windows 10, which we're all using now. Great, right? It's not bad. It's not bad. I could do without the massive forced updates that always sort of just appear randomly, and normally just before a presentation or something, and Windows is updating. Stuff like that is really bad. I wish they would just give you more choice in preventing those things. But yeah, I think for most people, Windows 10 is okay. Occasionally, I'm running on a few machines here, and occasionally I'll get an activate Windows, so I don't know what's happened. If you did, like here, you say this free upgrade to Windows 10, there's a very weird thing where you've updated from your Windows 7 or 8 to Windows 10, but you've somehow lost, you don't have a proper Windows 10 product key or something. I can't remember. So if you want to then do something with that machine, like put a new hard disk in, change the RAM, do something significant, even though you can download Windows 10, go okay, and then you put in your Windows 7 key, it's like, no, where's your Windows 10 key? So maybe there's a step there I've missed where I should have obtained the Windows 10 key after I'd done the upgrade, but they definitely don't make that obvious to you, and then certainly retrospectively don't make it easier for you to find it. So apparently, I'm just reading the comments. I have been having a look a little bit here. Linspire Lindos. God, I can't really remember Linspire Lindos. Again, some of those things which allow you to run Windows, I guess, or software on other OSs. Ubuntu's knowing GNOME. Jumping over Windows 8.1. I don't even remember 8.1. Was that where they just had got rid of the need to start up in Metro? It was something really minor like that. So there you go. So yeah, thank you for joining me through this little look for this website. I mean, it just popped up in Twitter or something, and it just caught my eye. Shame about the images not being a little bit more high res, but we can you can always go back and have a look. You can probably find some websites. I'm sure there's plenty dedicated to some of these things. And oh right, so about the Lindos for running Windows on Linux. I do remember one variant of that, because if you had an ePC, I do remember there is a Linux OS that's even more linked with Microsoft in that you can run Windows stuff. But the name escapes me, so who cares? So thank you for joining me. I hope that's been of some interest to you, and please comment, I guess, down below if you're watching this later, if you're watching it later in the day and you have your own thing to chime in on. Please like, share, subscribe if you're that way inclined to the channel, and as ever, thank you for watching. And he looks for the stop streaming button.